If you're not authorized, make your own arrangements.
That's what the HOA president shouted into a crowd of 40 terrified people, while a tornado bore down on our subdivision, and the community storm shelter sat chained shut behind her. She had a padlock on both handles. She had a printed list of approved names, and she had the nerve to stand there, calm as Sunday morning, sorting human beings into who deserved protection and who deserved to figure it out on their own. I watched Mrs. Perkins, 71, bad hip, leaning on her walker, cry while this woman waved her off like she was turning away a solicitor at the door. That's what unchecked HOA power looks like when the stakes are life and death. One woman with a clipboard deciding who gets to be safe. But here's the thing about Tammy Cresswell that she never understood. I'm the one who designed that shelter. I'm the one who installed a manual override she never knew existed. And I'm the one whose name was on the federal paperwork that said she had no right to lock that door. 3 minutes later, I was back. And every padlock, every chain, and every authorization card she'd ever issued became evidence. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Behind. My name's Garrett Maddox, and 3 years ago, I buried my wife Elaine in a cemetery just outside Moore, Oklahoma. She had pancreatic cancer. Took her in 11 months. I was overseas on a Corps of Engineers deployment when she first felt the pain in her back. And by the time I got home, the scans already looked like a forecast no one wanted to read. I held her hand through every round of chemo. I drove her to every appointment. And when she passed on a Tuesday morning in October, with the sun coming through the blinds, I realized I didn't know how to be a person without her. After that, I sold our house in Tulsa and moved to Cedar Ridge Estates to be closer to my daughter Bree and my grandson Colton. Cedar Ridge is one of those newer subdivisions just south of Moore, where the houses all look clean and the lawns all look the same, and there's a homeowners association that makes sure nobody steps out of line. I didn't mind the rules at first. I'd spent 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, so I understood structure. I understood chain of command. What I didn't understand was Tammy Cresswell. Tammy was the HOA president, had been for 6 years running. Blonde, heavy-set, always in some pastel polo tucked into white capris, carrying a clipboard like it was a scepter. Her husband Dale sold commercial insurance and mostly stayed quiet. Tammy did the talking for both of them. She ran the annual block party. She ran the landscaping committee. She ran the newsletter. And she ran the board meetings like a woman who believed her signature carried the same legal weight as a county judge's. The smell of fresh-cut Bermuda grass hung in the air the first time I met her. She showed up on my porch 3 days after I moved in, clipboard in hand, and told me my mailbox post was a 1/4 inch too short. Not a welcome basket, not a hello, not even a sorry about your wife. A citation. I fixed the mailbox. I kept my head down. I focused on my consulting work, emergency preparedness planning for schools and municipal buildings across the region. And when the neighborhood started talking about building a community storm shelter, I volunteered. This is Oklahoma, Tornado Alley. In 2013, an EF5 ripped through Moore and killed 24 people, flattened a school, turned brick houses into piles of splinters. Every neighborhood out here knows what a funnel cloud can do. So when Cedar Ridge formed a shelter committee, I stepped up and offered my expertise. I designed reinforced safe rooms for military installations in 3 countries. I drew up the plans, worked with the county engineer, secured a FEMA Community Safe Room grant that covered 60% of the cost, and supervised every single phase of construction. The shelter was a below-grade, reinforced concrete room, rated for EF5 winds, with capacity for 140 residents, ventilation, backup lighting, 2 exits, ADA-accessible ramp, emergency radio, and a manual override system I insisted on installing. A secondary access panel on the south exterior wall with a combination known only to me and the county fire marshal. That override existed for one reason. If the primary access ever failed during an emergency, someone could still get people inside. Tammy didn't help build the shelter. Tammy didn't attend a single construction meeting. She didn't donate $1 or lift a finger. But the day we cut the ribbon, she stood front and center with a pair of golden scissors like she'd poured the concrete herself. That should have been my first warning. 6 months after the shelter was finished, Tammy started noticing me, not in a friendly way. In the way a woman notices someone who doesn't attend her wine and cheese socials, doesn't comment on her landscaping awards, doesn't compliment her porch decorations, and doesn't treat her like the mayor of a subdivision. I was polite but private. I spent weekends with Colton building model rockets in the backyard, ran my consulting business from my home office, and maintained a small weather monitoring station near my back fence, a professional-grade Davis Vantage Pro 2 with an anemometer, rain gauge, and barometric sensor mounted on a 10-foot aluminum pole. That station let me track real-time conditions within a half-mile radius. In tornado country, that's not a hobby. That's survival. I shared the data with the County Emergency Management Office and with my neighbors on a group text. When a severe thunderstorm rolled through in March, my station picked up a sudden pressure drop 12 minutes before the NWS issued a warning. 3 families on my street moved to interior rooms because of that alert. Tammy didn't care. One Tuesday morning, I found a violation notice taped to my front door. Unauthorized structure exceeding HOA exterior modification guidelines. The fine was $200 per day until the station was removed. The letter was signed by Tammy, stamped with the HOA seal, and copied to the entire board. I read it twice. Then I pulled up the CC and Rs on my laptop. The HOA guidelines define structures as anything with a footprint exceeding 16 square feet or a height exceeding 12 feet. My weather station had a footprint of about 2 square feet and stood 10 feet tall. It didn't qualify, not even close. I filed a variance request with the county planning office anyway, just to create a paper trail. The county planner, a guy named Ruiz, who'd actually reviewed my shelter designs and knew my professional background, approved it in 4 business days. He even wrote a note saying the station was consistent with residential meteorological equipment commonly used in severe weather zones, and well below any threshold requiring a permit. I sent the approval to Tammy with a polite email. She didn't respond. The fines kept coming, $200 a day, like clockwork. The envelopes arrived every Monday, printed on HOA letterhead, each one signed with Tammy's looping cursive. By the end of the second week, the total on paper was $2,800. I saved every notice. I photographed every envelope. I logged every date with a timestamp. Here's something most people don't realize about HOA fines. In Oklahoma, an HOA can send you a fine letter all day long, but they can't actually collect without following specific procedures under the Oklahoma Nonprofit Corporation Act. They need proper written notice, a formal hearing opportunity with at least 15 days advance warning, and a recorded board vote. Tammy had skipped all 3. Her fines were legally unenforceable. They were expensive-looking suggestions on fancy paper. I didn't yell. I didn't knock on her door. I filed a formal dispute through the HOA's own grievance process and requested a hearing. Tammy scheduled it for 6 weeks out, which was the maximum delay allowed under the bylaws. She was stalling. I was documenting. The crunch of gravel under my boots every morning as I checked that weather station became a kind of ritual. Each reading I logged was another quiet act of defiance, and every fine she sent was another piece of paper in a folder that was getting thicker by the week. The next move Tammy made was the one that told me this wasn't about a weather station. This was about the shelter. This was about control. At the August board meeting, held in the community clubhouse with maybe 30 residents in folding chairs, and the smell of stale coffee and lemon floor polish hanging in the air, Tammy introduced what she called a Safety Infrastructure Management Resolution. It sounded official, it sounded reasonable, and it was designed to do exactly one thing: take the storm shelter away from me. The resolution reassigned all maintenance and access authority for the shelter from the original building committee to the HOA executive board. meaning Tammy. It removed my name from the maintenance roster. It authorized the board president to change all access codes and locking mechanisms as needed for security purposes. And it required residents to obtain written authorization from the board before using the shelter during severe weather events. Written authorization during a tornado in Oklahoma. Let that sink in for a second. She wanted people to fill out paperwork while the sky was falling. I stood up from my folding chair and objected. I explained that the shelter had been built with a FEMA Community Safe Room grant that carried specific federal compliance requirements, including unrestricted resident access during any National Weather Service tornado warning. I had the grant number memorized. I cited the section. Tammy cut me off mid-sentence. She said the resolution was about liability management, and that I was not a board member, and therefore had no standing to debate agenda items. She actually used that phrase, no standing, like this was her courtroom. 3 board members voted yes. Tammy, her vice president Connie Pratt, and a quiet man named Boyd Thatcher, who always voted whatever Tammy told him to. 2 others abstained. The resolution passed. Within a week, Tammy had a locksmith out at the shelter. I know because my neighbor Hank Drucker, a retired sheriff's deputy who lived 2 doors down, watched the whole thing from his porch. The locksmith replaced the electronic keypad I'd installed, the one that allowed any resident to enter a shared code during a weather emergency, with a heavy-duty padlock and chain. Only Tammy and Connie had keys. The override panel I'd built into the south wall, the one known only to me and the county fire marshal, was still there, hidden behind a flush-mounted steel utility cover that looked like any other service access point. Tammy didn't know it existed. She'd never opened the construction binder. She'd never read a single page of the building specifications. She just assumed that changing the lock meant she owned the door. I drove past the shelter on a Wednesday afternoon and saw the chain for the first time. Thick, galvanized steel, looped through both door handles, secured with a master lock the size of my fist. The concrete walls I'd spec'd to withstand 300-mile-per-hour winds were now locked up like a storage unit at the edge of town. I sat in my truck for a long time staring at that chain. The radio was playing some country song I don't remember. I remember the way the late afternoon sunlight hit that padlock and made it gleam. And I remember thinking, Elaine would have marched up there and cut that chain herself. That night, I started a new folder on my laptop. I labeled it Shelter Access, Legal. I downloaded every board meeting minute from the past 2 years off the HOA website. I saved every email. I pulled the original FEMA grant agreement from the filing cabinet in my garage, and I found the clause I was looking for. Section 4.2c. The grant recipient shall ensure that the safe room remains accessible to all designated occupants during any tornado warning issued by the National Weather Service for the applicable county. Tammy had just violated a federal grant agreement. She just didn't know it yet. The next thing Tammy went after was the one thing I did purely out of love for my neighbors. Every other Saturday, I ran a free emergency preparedness workshop in the community clubhouse. Nothing fancy. I'd set up a folding table with a checkered tablecloth, bring a stack of handouts I printed at the library, and spend about an hour teaching people the things that could save their lives. How to build a 72-hour emergency kit. The difference between a tornado watch and a tornado warning, because you'd be surprised how many people mix those up. How to create a family communication plan so everyone knows where to meet if cell towers go down. Where the nearest public shelters were located if the community one was unavailable. How to read a radar map on your phone. How to recognize the signs of a developing supercell. About 15 to 20 people showed up each session. Mrs. Loretta Perkins, a 71-year-old widow with a walker and a bad hip who lived at the end of Magnolia Lane, never missed one. She'd sit in the front row with her reading glasses on and take notes in a composition book. Hank Drucker always came and always brought a box of donuts from the bakery on 19th Street. The Cooper family brought their kids and let them practice packing go bags. It was the most useful, most human thing happening in Cedar Ridge, and it cost nobody a cent. Tammy sent me a cease and desist letter on HOA letterhead. She called my workshop an unauthorized commercial activity conducted on HOA common property and demanded I stop immediately or face a $5,000 penalty. Commercial activity. I wasn't charging a dime. I was handing out photocopied checklists and teaching retired couples how to fill a water jug and store canned goods. But here's the thing about Tammy's letter that made me smile instead of sweat. She cited Section 7.3 of the CC&Rs, which governs commercial solicitation and business operations on common areas. I'd read that section carefully. It applied exclusively to vendors, salespeople, direct marketers, and businesses operating for profit on HOA property. A free educational workshop run by a resident volunteer didn't come within a mile of that definition. You could have had a first-year law student tear that argument apart during lunch. But more importantly, I noticed something else while reading the bylaws cover to cover that night. Something Tammy clearly hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about. Section 12.1, titled Amendments to Common Area Access Policies, stated in plain language that any change to the access policy for shared infrastructure, including but not limited to the community pool, the clubhouse, and the storm shelter, required a full membership vote. Not a board vote, a full membership vote with a minimum of 60% approval from all homeowners in the subdivision. Tammy's Safety Infrastructure Management Resolution had been passed by 3 board members in a room of 30 people. It had never gone to a membership vote, which meant, under the HOA's own bylaws, the resolution was procedurally void. It had no legal force. The padlock on that shelter was hanging from a chain, attached to nothing but Tammy's ego. I printed Section 12.1. I highlighted the key sentences in yellow. I made 3 copies, and I added it to the folder. The diesel smell from Hank's old Ford F-250 drifted through my open window as he pulled into his driveway that evening. I walked over with 2 cold beers and handed him one. I showed him the highlighted text. Hank read it slowly, looked up at me over his reading glasses, and said 2 words that sounded like a starting gun. Get 'em. I was starting to build something much bigger than a complaint, and Tammy had no idea it was coming. The real weapon came from a filing cabinet in my garage, tucked behind a box of Elaine's gardening books I still couldn't bring myself to donate. I'd kept every document from the shelter project. Blueprints, structural calculations, inspection reports, correspondence with FEMA Region 6 in Denton, the original grant application, subcontractor invoices, and the master construction contract. I hadn't touched that box in 2 years. It smelled like old paper and garage dust when I set it on the kitchen table and started reading. The FEMA Community Safe Room Grant Agreement was 31 pages long. Most of it was standard boilerplate about construction specifications, reporting requirements, and maintenance obligations. But Section 4, titled Operational Compliance, was the section that changed everything. Section 4.2c required the shelter to remain accessible during any tornado warning. I already knew that. But Section 4.3a was the one that made my hands stop moving across the page. It stated that the grant recipient, Cedar Ridge Estates HOA, was required to designate an emergency access coordinator responsible for ensuring shelter availability during severe weather events. The coordinator would serve as the primary contact between the community, the County Emergency Management Office, and FEMA in all matters relating to the shelter's operational readiness. And the original designation form, signed by the previous HOA president 2.5 years ago and filed with FEMA Region 6 in Denton, Texas, named one person in that role, Garrett Maddox. That designation had never been amended. It had never been revoked, and it couldn't be revoked by the HOA board alone. Revocation required a formal amendment filed with FEMA and approved by the Regional Compliance Office, a process that took a minimum of 90 days and required documented cause. Tammy's resolution, her new padlock, her authorization cards, none of it changed my federal designation. As far as FEMA was concerned, I was still the man in charge of that shelter. But it got even better. The construction contract, which I'd helped draft, and which was signed by the HOA, the general contractor, and the county, included Appendix D, Emergency Override Protocol. That appendix documented the secondary access panel I'd designed into the south wall. It listed the 6-digit combination, and it stated in clear legal language that the override could be activated by the Emergency Access Coordinator or the County Fire Marshal in any situation where primary access is obstructed, disabled, or denied. Tammy had locked the front door, but she didn't know about the back door. And she had no idea that the man she'd been fining, silencing, and trying to push out of the neighborhood was the only person in Cedar Ridge with both the legal authority and the physical means to open that shelter when it mattered most. I closed the contract. I poured 2 fingers of Woodford Reserve, and I picked up the phone. The first call went to Captain Roy Eastman, the Cleveland County Fire Marshal. Roy and I had worked side by side during the shelter construction. He was a big man with a gray handlebar mustache, hands like baseball mitts, and a voice that sounded like a diesel engine idling in a gravel lot. When I told him what Tammy had done, the padlock, the authorization cards, the restricted access policy during severe weather, he went quiet for about 10 full seconds. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "That woman is going to get somebody killed." Roy agreed to conduct an unannounced fire safety inspection of the shelter within 30 days. Under Oklahoma Fire Code, any public or community shelter rated for more than 50 occupants was subject to periodic inspection by the county fire marshal's office, and the fire marshal had the authority to order immediate corrective action for any code violation, including access obstruction. A padlocked community shelter was about as clear-cut a violation as you could find. The second call went to the FEMA Region 6 Compliance Office in Denton. I spoke with a grants compliance officer named Diane Weaver. I laid out the entire situation, the resolution, the padlock, the access policy, the email about board discretion, and emailed her copies of the original grant agreement, my designation form, and time-stamped photographs of the padlock and chain I'd taken on 3 different dates. Diane was professional, but I could hear the edge in her voice. She told me that if the shelter was confirmed to be inaccessible during a National Weather Service tornado warning, FEMA could demand full repayment of the entire grant amount, roughly $182,000, from the HOA. She opened a formal case file and assigned it a tracking number. $182,000. That was the price tag on Tammy's padlock. The third call went to my neighbor Hank. Over black coffee on his back porch, the morning air smelling like Oklahoma red clay and fresh-cut grass from the lot behind his fence, I laid out the whole strategy on a yellow legal pad. Hank had spent 28 years with the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office before retiring. He still knew people. He agreed to file a citizen safety complaint with the Sheriff's Department, formally documenting the restricted shelter access as a potential public endangerment issue. He also agreed to collect written statements from other neighbors. The fourth call went to my daughter Bree. Bree's college roommate from OU, Ashley Montoya, now worked as a field producer at KFOR-TV, the NBC affiliate in Oklahoma City. Ashley had spent 3 years covering tornado aftermath and severe weather stories across central Oklahoma. When Bree told her about an HOA president who had padlocked a FEMA-funded storm shelter in Tornado Alley, Ashley didn't hesitate. She said she wanted the story, and she wanted to be there when it broke open. I wasn't just building a legal case anymore. I was building a net. And this is something anyone dealing with a rogue HOA board or an abusive neighborhood leader should understand, because it's the most important strategic lesson in this entire story. One complaint to one agency might get ignored. One phone call might get lost. One letter might sit in a stack on someone's desk for months. But when you create simultaneous pressure from multiple independent directions, federal compliance, fire safety code, county law enforcement, and broadcast media, the system can't ignore you. No single bureaucracy shrugs off that kind of weight, it becomes a convergence, and convergence creates consequences. I gathered my allies carefully. Mrs. Perkins signed a written affidavit describing how she'd been told she would need pre-approval to access the shelter, and how that made her fear for her safety during tornado season. 3 other households, the Drake family on Cedar Court, the Coopers on Magnolia, and a retired school teacher named Dolores Vance who'd lived in Cedar Ridge longer than anyone, each submitted formal written complaints to both the HOA and the County Emergency Management Office. Hank handled the sheriff's department filing himself, walked it into the office in person, and made sure it was date-stamped. And every evening, I drove past that shelter, looked at that padlock gleaming under the parking lot light, and pulled up the 7-day weather forecast on my phone. Tornado season was rolling toward central Oklahoma like a freight train, and this time, I was ready for it. Tammy found out I was making noise, and she responded the way people with fake power always respond when they feel it slipping. She doubled down, hard. In early April, I received a certified letter from an attorney named Blaine Geiger. Corner office in Norman, represented small businesses and community associations. The letter informed me that a property lien had been filed against my home for accumulated unpaid assessment penalties, totaling $14,600. That number included the weather station fines I'd been formally contesting through the HOA's own grievance process, the $5,000 workshop penalty I'd never acknowledged, and a brand new charge I'd never even heard of, a $2,000 special assessment for shelter security infrastructure upgrades. I'll say that again. Tammy was charging me $2,000 for the padlock and chain she used to lock me out of the shelter I built. There's a certain kind of audacity that stops being infuriating and starts being almost impressive. Almost. I called my attorney the same afternoon. Janet Okoro operated a small firm in downtown Oklahoma City that specialized in HOA disputes, real property law, and homeowner rights litigation. She was sharp, calm, and she didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. Janet reviewed the lien filing and the supporting documentation, or rather, the lack of it, and told me it was, in her words, procedurally defective on at least 4 independent grounds. The HOA had never held the required hearing before imposing the underlying fines. They had never provided the 15-day written cure notice required under Oklahoma's Residential Property Act. They had never obtained a board resolution specifically authorizing the lien filing, and several of the charges included in the total were still under active formal dispute. Janet filed a motion to invalidate the lien with the county clerk's office. She also sent a letter to Blaine Geiger, informing him that his client was in violation of the Oklahoma Residential Property Act, the federal FEMA grant compliance agreement, and potentially the Oklahoma Criminal Code provisions regarding reckless endangerment of public safety. She told him that if the lien was not voluntarily released within 14 days, she would file a countersuit for abuse of process, defamation, and tortious interference. Blaine Geiger did not respond within 14 days. Meanwhile, Tammy shifted tactics from legal to personal. She started a whisper campaign through the neighborhood. She told the Drake family that I had anger issues and was becoming confrontational. She told the Winds that I was fixated on the shelter in an unhealthy way. She told Mrs. Perkins, sweet 71-year-old Loretta Perkins, with her walker and her hearing aids and her composition notebook, that I was mentally unstable and that my behavior was concerning and that neighbors should keep their distance. Mrs. Perkins called me that Tuesday night. Her voice was trembling, and not because she believed a word of it. She was angry. "That woman told me you're dangerous," she said. "Garrett, you're the only reason I know what to do when those sirens go off. You're the reason I sleep at night during storm season." I told Mrs. Perkins not to worry. I told her the sirens would go off eventually. This was Oklahoma in April, and when they did, that shelter would be open. I made her a promise, and I intended to keep it. Tammy made one final board-level move. At the April meeting, she had Connie Pratt propose a motion to ban me from all HOA common areas, the clubhouse, the community pool, the walking trail, the playground, and the storm shelter for repeated violations, non-payment of assessments, and conduct hostile to the interests of the association. The motion passed, 3-2, same 3 votes, same rubber stamp. I wasn't even at the meeting. Hank was. He told me Tammy smiled when the vote went through, like she'd just checkmated the last piece on the board. She had absolutely no idea what was already in motion behind her. The first full week of May brought the kind of weather that makes every person in central Oklahoma start checking their phone every 30 minutes. A massive low-pressure system was crawling east across the Texas Panhandle, dragging with it a warm front loaded with Gulf moisture. The Storm Prediction Center in Norman, the same facility that tracks every supercell and mesocyclone in the country, issued an enhanced risk for severe thunderstorms across central Oklahoma, including Cleveland County, with the possibility of significant tornadoes. EF2 or greater. Local meteorologists on every channel were using words like volatile, explosive instability, and historic shear profiles. The kind of language that makes people in other states check if Oklahoma is even a real place. I checked my weather station readings every 2 hours. Barometric pressure was dropping, in a slow, steady curve that looked like a ski slope on the graph. Surface dew points were climbing into the low 70s, tropical moisture levels. Upper-level wind shear was increasing, and the hodographs were curving into the kind of pattern that any storm chaser recognizes. The pattern that breeds rotating supercells. I could feel it in the air. Anyone who's lived in Tornado Alley long enough knows what I mean. That heavy, electric stillness where the wind dies and the birds go silent and the sky takes on a yellowish-green tinge that doesn't belong in any normal sunset. It's like the atmosphere is holding its breath. And then Tammy sent her email. It went out to the entire Cedar Ridge HOA distribution list at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Subject line: Storm Shelter Access Protocol, Updated Guidance. The email was 3 paragraphs long and written in the kind of bureaucratic language that tries to make cruelty sound administrative. It stated that due to ongoing security concerns and unauthorized access attempts, the community storm shelter would be opened at the sole discretion of the HOA president during severe weather events. It stated that all residents must present valid authorization documentation before entry would be permitted. And then came the line that still makes my jaw tighten every time I read it. The email stated that residents who are currently subject to disciplinary action by the board should make alternative arrangements for severe weather protection. Make alternative arrangements during a tornado in Oklahoma. She was talking about me, but she was also talking about Mrs. Perkins, who had signed the affidavit, and the Drakes, who had filed a complaint, and Dolores Vance, who had spoken out at a meeting. Anyone who had dared to push back against Tammy Cresswell was now officially told to find their own place to hide when the sky started spinning. I printed that email. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Janet Okoro, to Captain Eastman, and to Diane Weaver at FEMA. Hank came over that night. We sat on my back porch in silence for a while, watching distant lightning pulse and flicker along the entire southern horizon like a slow strobe behind dark clouds. The air smelled like rain and copper, and the ozone tang that comes before something big. Hank took a sip of his beer and said quietly, "She's going to get someone killed, Garrett." I said, "No, she's not, because we're not going to let her." I made 2 phone calls. First to Captain Eastman, who confirmed his inspection team was on standby and he'd be personally monitoring the weather situation across Cleveland County. Second, to Ashley Montoya at KFOR, who told me her camera crew could be rolling in Cedar Ridge within 40 minutes of a confirmed tornado warning. That night I laid everything out on my kitchen table like a battle map. The FEMA grant agreement, the construction contract with Appendix D, the override combination on a laminated card, the fire marshal's direct cell number, Mrs. Perkins's affidavit, the stack of violation notices 3 inches thick, Tammy's "Make alternative arrangements" email, printed and highlighted in 3 colors. Every board meeting minute, every photograph of that padlock. I put the override access tool, a specialized hex key that fit the bolts on the utility panel, in my truck's glove compartment alongside the laminated combination card. I set 3 weather alert apps on my phone with maximum notification settings for Cleveland County, and I waited. The thunder rolled closer that night, shaking the windows. The wind picked up and rattled the gutters. Outside, my weather station's anemometer was spinning faster than I'd seen it spin in months. Oklahoma was about to remind Tammy Cresswell why storm shelters exist. It came on a Thursday afternoon, just after 3 o'clock. The Storm Prediction Center upgraded central Oklahoma to a particularly dangerous situation, a PDS tornado watch, at 1:15 p.m. That's the highest alert level before an actual tornado is on the ground. By 2:30, Doppler radar out of Twin Lakes showed a massive supercell tracking northeast toward the Moore corridor, and the rotation signature on the mesocyclone was tightening fast. The hook echo on the radar looked like a textbook illustration from a meteorology course. At 3:52 p.m., the National Weather Service office in Norman issued a tornado warning for Cleveland County, including the Cedar Ridge Estates subdivision. The warning polygon covered us completely. Estimated arrival of the tornado, 20 to 25 minutes. The sirens lit up across the neighborhood. Every pole, every speaker, every rooftop unit. That sound, that rising, falling wail that climbs and drops and climbs again, is something you never get used to, no matter how many years you've lived in Oklahoma. It cuts through walls, through closed windows, through whatever you were thinking about, and replaces every thought with one single word: move. I was in my truck within 60 seconds. I drove to the shelter first. It was only 3 blocks from my house, but I needed to see the situation before I acted. The scene was exactly what I'd spent months fearing. About 40 residents had already gathered at the shelter entrance. Mrs. Perkins was there, leaning on her walker, with Hank's wife Carol holding her arm to keep her steady against the wind. The Cooper family was there with their 2 small children, Emma, who was 6, and baby Jack in a car seat carrier. The Drakes, Dolores Vance clutching her purse with both hands, the Nguyen family from Elm Court, a dozen other faces I recognized from my workshops, and Tammy Cresswell was standing at the shelter door, padlock still on the chain, clipboard in her left hand, yellow rain jacket zipped to her chin. She was checking names against a printed list, asking people for authorization cards, while the sky behind her was turning the color of a deep bruise, and the wind was pulling at the trees hard enough to snap dead branches. I heard her say to a woman I didn't recognize, "If you're not on the approved list, you'll need to contact the board office for authorization." The board office, a P.O. box at a strip mall on 19th Street. It didn't have a phone number. It wasn't staffed. It was a mailbox. Hank was 2 feet from Tammy, arguing with her. His face was red. He was pointing at the sky and then at the lock and telling her to open the door. Tammy was shaking her head. Mrs. Perkins was crying, one hand on her walker and the other pressed against her chest. A young mother I'd never met was holding her baby against her shoulder and asking Tammy, "Please, please just open the door." And Tammy said, I heard this clearly, "Ma'am, there are procedures we have to follow." Procedures. With a funnel cloud forming 5 miles south. I didn't yell. I didn't grab the chain. I got back in my truck and drove 3 minutes to my house. I pulled the hex key and the laminated combination card from the glove compartment. I grabbed the manila folder with the FEMA designation form and the construction contract, and I drove back. When I pulled up, the wind was howling, and the first fat raindrops were splattering on the asphalt like paintballs. I walked past Tammy without looking at her. I went around to the south side of the shelter. The utility cover was exactly where I'd placed it during construction, a 12 by 12 inch steel panel set flush with the concrete wall, held in place by 4 recessed hex bolts. I fitted the key, removed each bolt, and swung the panel open. Inside was the manual override keypad, a 6-digit mechanical combination lock that controlled the electromagnetic release on the main door. I entered the combination, 6 digits, 2 seconds. The electromagnetic lock on the main door released with a deep, heavy, metallic clunk that echoed across the entire parking lot. The padlock was still hanging on the chain, but the steel door behind it swung free on its secondary hinges. Hank heard the sound, grabbed the chain with both hands, pulled it loose, and threw both doors wide open. People poured inside, Mrs. Perkins first, with Carol guiding her carefully down the ADA ramp. Then the families, the children, the baby, Dolores, the Winds. 43 people moved into that shelter in under 2 minutes. Orderly, quiet, relieved. Tammy stood frozen on the concrete pad outside. Her clipboard was shaking. Her mouth was open. She looked at me like I'd just torn her kingdom down with my bare hands. I didn't say a word to her. I didn't need to. Captain Roy Eastman pulled up in his county fire marshal vehicle 30 seconds later, red lights flashing. He'd been monitoring the warning from his office in Norman and drove straight to Cedar Ridge the moment the warning polygon appeared on his screen. He stepped out, saw the padlock lying on the ground, saw the chain, saw Tammy standing there with her little list, and saw 43 residents filing into a shelter that she had tried to keep locked. And then the white KFOR news van turned the corner onto Shelter Lane. Ashley Montoya jumped out with her camera operator, and they started rolling immediately. The camera caught the padlock, the chain, the open doors, Tammy's face. The tornado passed 2.5 miles south of Cedar Ridge. It was confirmed later as an EF3 with peak winds around 165 miles per hour. It destroyed a strip mall, flattened a car dealership, and damaged more than 40 homes in a subdivision called Briarwood Crossing. 2 people there were seriously injured. Nobody in Cedar Ridge was hurt, because the shelter was open. Captain Eastman approached Tammy while the cameras were rolling. He spoke calmly, clearly, and loud enough for the microphone to pick up every word. He asked her why a FEMA-funded community storm shelter had been padlocked with a chain during an active tornado warning. Tammy started talking, fast, nervous, fragmented, about procedures and authorization protocols and board policy and security. Roy held up one hand and she stopped. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm issuing you a citation for obstruction of emergency access under Oklahoma Statute Title 11, Section 22-116. You have the right to consult an attorney before responding, but this shelter should never have been locked." Tammy's face went white. The color drained out of her like someone had pulled a plug. Connie Pratt, who had been standing 10 feet behind her the entire time saying nothing, quietly picked up her own clipboard, walked to her car, and drove away without a word. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office arrived 12 minutes later. A deputy took formal statements from Hank, Mrs. Perkins, the Coopers, and me. Hank handed over copies of every document we'd assembled. Mrs. Perkins, still seated inside the shelter in a folding chair with her walker beside her, gave her statement with a steady voice. She didn't cry this time. She was calm, she was clear, and she was absolutely furious. The K4 footage aired on the 6 o'clock news that evening. By 9 p.m., it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By Friday morning, it was everywhere. The aftermath came fast, and it came from every direction at once. FEMA Region 6 opened a formal compliance investigation within 72 hours of the incident. Diane Weaver flew from Denton to Oklahoma City personally. After reviewing the padlock, the access policy emails, Tammy's "make alternative arrangements" message, and the board meeting minutes, FEMA issued a notice of non-compliance to Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA. The notice gave the HOA 60 days to restore full, unrestricted emergency access to the shelter, and to submit a corrective action plan, or face mandatory repayment of the entire grant amount, $182,000. That number got the attention of every homeowner in the subdivision. The HOA called an emergency general membership meeting. This wasn't 3 board members in a clubhouse anymore. This was 112 homeowners packed into the Cedar Ridge Elementary School cafeteria on a Saturday morning, sitting in tiny chairs designed for 3rd graders, and they were not happy. The vote to remove Tammy Cresswell from the HOA board was 97-11. It wasn't close. It wasn't even a contest. Connie Pratt had already submitted her resignation letter the night before. Boyd Thatcher, the 3rd reliable yes vote, stood up in front of his neighbors and publicly apologized for going along with resolutions he knew were wrong. The Cleveland County District Attorney's Office filed misdemeanor reckless endangerment charges against Tammy Cresswell. Her attorney, Blaine Geiger, the same one who'd sent me that lien letter, tried to negotiate a plea deal. But the DA had seen the KFOR footage, had read the FEMA report, and wasn't interested in going easy. Tammy eventually pleaded no contest. She received 2 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a $5,000 fine payable to the County Emergency Services Fund, and a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board in the state of Oklahoma. Janet Okoro got the fraudulent lien against my property discharged within a week. She also filed a civil action against the HOA for harassment, abusive process, and retaliatory conduct. The newly elected board, eager to put the entire Tammy era behind them, settled quickly. A formal written apology published in the HOA newsletter, full reimbursement of all my legal fees, and rescission of every fine and penalty that had been issued against me. The storm shelter access policy was rewritten from scratch with input from me, Captain Eastman, and the County Emergency Management Office. The new policy is simple. Whenever the National Weather Service issues a tornado warning that includes Cedar Ridge Estates, the shelter doors unlock automatically via the electromagnetic system and remain open until the warning expires. No authorization cards, no clipboards, no padlocks, no lists. Just open doors when people need them. The way it always should have been. The county officially recognized me as the Cedar Ridge Community Emergency Coordinator, a title I'd technically held under the FEMA grant the entire time, but now formally acknowledged by the Cleveland County Emergency Management Office. I resumed my Saturday preparedness workshops. Attendance doubled. Mrs. Perkins still sits in the front row, still takes notes, still hasn't missed a single one. And the best part came from Bree. About a month after everything settled, she sat down with me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd spread out all those documents, and told me she had an idea. She wanted to start a scholarship fund for students pursuing degrees in emergency management at the University of Oklahoma. She wanted to name it after her mother. The Elaine Maddox Emergency Preparedness Scholarship awarded its first 2 grants that fall. One went to a young woman from Del City who wanted to work in FEMA disaster response. The other went to a kid from Stillwater whose family had lost their home in a tornado when he was 12 years old, and who wanted to make sure other families had shelters to go to. I stood at that little ceremony in a conference room on the OU campus and looked at the faces around me. Bree, Colton, Hank and Carol, Mrs. Perkins in the front row like always, Dolores Vance, the Coopers, the Drakes, and I thought about Elaine. She would have liked Cedar Ridge. She would have liked these people. And she absolutely would have had something sharp and perfect to say about Tammy Cresswell and her clipboard. If you've ever had an HOA try to control something that could save your life, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because next week, I've got a story about a man whose HOA tried to demolish his detached garage and ended up writing him a check that paid for the entire renovation and then some. Trust me, that one's going to be a real good time.